And as weird as it sounds, the background actually just matches what this is about. For All right, so what I had prepared for this month's, they used to be known as Ruby conferences, but they're the Cutting Edge podcast. Welcome to the May 2021 Cutting Edge podcast. And I want to do something a little bit different this particular episode, because oftentimes we're discussing human nature on like a very grand scale within Jungian analytical psychology, four sides of the mind, that kind of thing. But sometimes it's really important to link to a point of figuring out like, okay, hey, are we ever going to look at the practical application, or how do we actually link the nature to the nurture side? How does it affect us, as human beings, etc.? And I actually got into a debate recently with many different people. It was basically like having the conversation over and over and over again, talking about the trickster functions, specifically TI trickster and FI trickster, and what kind of notions or sociological terminologies or states of being could be derived as a result of knowing, whether or not these are actually applicable in real life. And the reality of the situation is that, yes, they're very applicable, but the fact that both of them exist, even though they oftentimes actually cancel each other out because they're both trickster functions, ends up causing one to have a completely different perspective about how life actually works, or life as we know it, which then ends up providing challenge to the human nurture component, a lot of challenge actually. And this challenge it'll challenge rules, it'll challenge social norms, so whatever rule-based norms or social norms or anything from a sociological standpoint that society itself is actually based upon, all of that could be an issue, right? And I don't want to put ourselves in a position where we're often victims or slaves, as it were, of our human nurture. And this is where, cognitive functions from a natural standpoint end up rendering challenge to human nurture, okay? Trickster and TI trickster, you can actually begin to understand the battle versus truth and falsehood versus good versus evil, right? And you end up understanding that there's a lot to be said about the objectivity and the subjectivity of these terms. And it can be a serious issue there. Why? Well, the thing is that oftentimes people are making their judgments, and it leads to a form of psychological prejudice because of their judgments. And their judgments are good versus evil judgments, or good versus bad judgments, or truth versus falsehood judgments. Now, let's back up a second. You got to understand that, like, if you're making an FI-related judgment, I feel this is a good or bad thing. Or if you're making a TI-related judgment, this is a true or false thing. The fact that TI trickster and FI trickster both exist, it means that both perspectives are relevant. Both perspectives are valid. And just because you're a TI user and you think you know what's true, etc., that doesn't mean you're entirely objective. Because to be entirely objective, you would literally have to know everything to be entirely objective. The same can be said about an FI user making their value judgments and weighing things out in their heads, etc., and knowing the values of things. That, too, is a form of subjectivity. Now, granted, TI is an objective function, and technically FI is an objective function, but FI is more subjective than TI is. TI is more objective. The problem is that when TI is wielded in the hands of like a human being, they're still making their TI truth judgments based on working assumptions. And working assumptions themselves are, guess what? They are subjective, right? So that, too, is an issue. It's a big problem. So we have to get ourselves in a situation where we are aware that, FI trickster, which is, when someone's a FI trickster, we just don't really have a basis for moral decision making. But that doesn't mean that morals doesn't exist, right? And the same thing with the TI trickster. They lack the ability to understand facts in a real intrinsic way, right? And they're not so fact-based with their awareness. And what this ends up doing is it causes other people, to be judgmental towards each other, because then it's literally like, you have the group of the red hats versus the group of the blue hats, and they just hate each other for some reason. The blue hats are the TI tricksters, and the red hats are the FI tricksters, basically. And one side is telling the other, hey, you don't know the facts, and the other side is saying, well, you're not really good people, etc. You're not actually good. So, as a result of that causes a lot of conflict. And the conflict is completely unnecessary. And the reason why is because it's not good enough for a human being to judge something good versus bad, and it's not good enough for a human being to judge something true versus false. Because in effect, you are, as I've said, on a Facebook posting in the past, in effect, you are playing God. You're essentially playing God when you make the claim that something is good or bad, or when you make the claim that something is true or false. You are playing God. And this is why Socrates is famously known for, saying the statement, the only thing I really truly know is that I know nothing, right? And that's how he's able to come to that conclusion, because even Socrates, just like King Solomon before him, and they're both ENTPs, they're both FI trickster, they're both TI parent, with how they were making their conclusions, the conclusions that they reached was, you can't be, making these judgments. They understood that, TI in its own right is still based on working assumptions, and FI in its own right is really entirely subjective. So the only thing that what's left for man is wisdom and obtaining wisdom, because that's all that is actually available for humanity, is gaining wisdom. And this is proven, especially through Socrates' statement about how the only thing I really know is that I know nothing. Or from Solomon's statement in his book that he wrote just before his death, it's called Ecclesiastes. He wrote about how everything in life is vanity. It's meaningless. It's just a chasing after the wind. What does a man gain from under the sun? With all of his effort, he really gains nothing, right? That's more of an introverted sensing perspective, whereas Socrates' perspective is more of an introverted thinking perspective. But both those perspectives from both those ENTPs, given that they have FI trickster, are still valid, right? And even they themselves have come to the point where they're basically admitting that they really don't know that much. But then at the same time, they would still point their finger at TE users and be like, everything that you guys are judging is still subjective. Yes, TI is the closest thing to objectivity that we have cognitively as a species, but it's still not truly objective, because TI is still based oftentimes on working assumptions. Granted, you look at extroverted thinking, which is, how introverted feeling is expressed, right? And it's about a system of qualification. I need to qualify something to get XYZ value. It's kind of like a numbers game to a point. Whereas with introverted thinking, it's a process of elimination. I can arrive to my conclusion by eliminating things. But in order for them to do that, they have to make the assumption that a certain object or thing that they're judging, or person, place, thing, insert noun here or adjective here, that they are assuming that that object could potentially have all attributes, and then they are subtracting what attributes that are not being observed, and then whatever attributes are left over, they're making their TI decision. Okay, this is true, based on subtraction. Whereas TE is from the addition standpoint. I'm going to qualify, I'm going to add all of these things up, and then because XYZ things plus this plus this plus this equals this, that's my conclusion, right? That's the TE way of doing things. The FI way of things, that's the addition approach, right? So subtraction is a lot closer to logic, whereas qualification or addition is a lot closer to morality. It's a lot closer to rational thinking, etc. And that's where they come from. The difference is, though, is that human beings still don't really know. When you do a statistical analysis or you do surveys, etc., you still have the risk of having bias. You have the risk of bias and favoritism as a result of people taking those TE surveys, which lends them to this situation where it's still subjective. Because depending on who they would ask that survey to, each person's going to have a different perspective. And just because 70% of people say this, that doesn't mean anything. It really doesn't mean anything. So it's subjective. But then you look at the TI users who are closer to objectivity. In order for them to draw their conclusions, they have to make assumptions based about certain attributes being applied to a person, place, or thing, XYZ noun, etc. And then they do their elimination process there. This is still also a problem. That's not really appropriate, right? So the bottom line is that do the TI users absolutely know the absolute truth? No, they don't. Do the FI users absolutely know the absolute good? No, they don't. And remember, absolute truth actually does exist. This is why it is objective. And it's because you could prove, using like a mathematical proving system, using logic, using logos, you can prove the existence of absolute truth, because using the model, if someone was to claim that absolute truth doesn't exist, someone would have to be able to question them on that claim. Is that a true or false statement? If they claim that that is a true statement, if they claim it's a false statement, it cancels out. And if they claim it's a true statement, it still cancels out, because then the only thing left over, logically speaking, through process of subtraction, is that, yes, absolute truth has to exist. Absolute good, however, is something entirely subjective. And it's outside of human hands, folks. Like, in order for you to really know the absolute truth, you would have to be a TI user who is able to come to a conclusion without making working assumptions. Yes, your process could be objective, but that doesn't mean you're going to end up at an objective truth, right? And the same thing with TE, your process could be good or appropriate or right on, but you're not going to end up at the absolute good. There's no guarantee, because it's too subjective for that. So what am I saying? I'm making the point is that if you as a human being, if you're going out there being judgmental towards people and judging people as good or bad or as smart or stupid, you are wrong. You are literally playing God. Who are you to make that conclusion? When you have the wisest man on earth and the man who is considered to be the smartest man on earth, both of them saying that it is entirely, thank you so much, that both of them are saying that it is entirely like a chasing after the wind. It is vanity. It is meaningless. Or the only thing I really know is that I know nothing, okay? So what business do you folks have judging yourselves or other people stupid? I mean, even Jesus Christ himself said that you are in danger of the fires of hell when you call somebody a fool. And that's a huge problem too. So, yeah. And as Robert Potts pointed out, if you say absolute truth doesn't exist 100% of the time, that in itself is a statement of absolute truth. It cancels out. So the objective way to thinking to reach the conclusion that you know nothing. Yeah, I know exactly, Color of the Sky, because that's exactly Socrates' point. And this is where the Socratic method comes from, because what the Socratic method does is that the entire purpose of the Socratic method, it's not to win arguments. It's actually to cause the other person that you're in a debate with to realize that they don't actually know anything. To actually come to the point where they too can admit to themselves that the only thing they truly actually know is that they don't know anything. That's the point. So when you're in debates, like, this really, really, really matters. So what's the only thing left for humankind? Because I've just proven to you that humanity is literally playing God when they are judging something good or bad, or true or false. What is it? And the answer to that question is, it's wisdom. Wisdom is the answer to that. I'm actually going to pull up a direct quote for you guys here. Okay, what is the definition of wisdom, right? And that's a really hard thing to define. Wisdom is extremely hard to define. Wisdom itself, folks, guess what? It is subjective, okay? I always love conversations with John because he's an INFJ and we really, really get into it. Okay, you said that TI is technically subjective and FI. That's what I don't quite understand. And then I respond with, TI is not subjective. Where did I say that? And then he's like, okay, well, what did you say? Because he says, you said that FI was subjective, and I thought you said that TI is technically subjective as well in our last call on Sunday, saying that the demon is necessary to develop because humans can only get wisdom because we can't make perfect judgments on truth or goodness, as to do so is to play God. And I'm like, hold on, TI is objective. It's just not always known. Only God knows the truth. Man cannot grasp truth because man is not the truth, but God is, from this model, basically. So he responds with, so what's the point of having TI if you can't grasp the truth? Now, this is what every TI user asks me at this moment. And then I said, okay, look, unlike FI, TI has the ability to master humility, which is the FE part of the axis, okay? TI can know things, just not always. It is often very little that can actually be known. We know absolute truth exists, and the only thing a human can truly know is that they know nothing. I'm quoting Socrates there. There are two things that can be known to humans. And the third is that a human should be spending their time in pursuit of wisdom, love and forgiveness, instead of true, false, or good, bad, which is my main point, So he goes on, and he's like, if we could know truth better as humans, would it be the greatest thing that humans could pursue? Or do we have to settle for wisdom, love, and forgiveness? Are these our burden to carry because absolute truth and absolute good are things that we cannot access? Or are wisdom, love, and forgiveness of equal value? I still don't buy that the pursuit of truth and goodness are not the priority. Are the three you mentioned, wisdom, love, and forgiveness, tied to the development of the four sides at all? Otherwise, those two feel arbitrary. And my response is this. The issue comes down to judgment. We cannot reduce God to our judgment. Our judgment is puny, it's ineffective, it's incomplete. We can only see the concrete. God sees the abstract side. We can only see the concrete, good, true, wise, etc., etc. Wisdom is defined by this. Here's the definition, folks. Wisdom is defined by the amalgamation or the combination of true versus falsehood and goodness versus badness or good versus evil at the same time. That's what wisdom is, okay? Now, if you think about it, because it's an amalgamation, wisdom itself is, when you're looking at judgment functions, TIFE, right? This is why TI users need to be humble, and humility comes from extrovert feeling. So this is why TI users are often called arrogant, because they're lacking in FE. And this is why high TI users like TI heroes and TI parents are often labeled as arrogant because they don't have enough FE, right? Or when they have too much FE for an FE hero and an FE parent, they are seen as self-deprecating, okay? There's still a humility problem. It's either too much humility or it's too little humility, basically, right? And it doesn't matter where your TI is in your function stack. There's a humility problem for the TIFE user. It's that simple. But you can also make the same argument with an FI user because they have that superiority complex. It's the FI superiority complex. Look at my achievements, my TE achievements, right? That still also is a problem. So wisdom, at the end of the day, becomes the only thing that's truly, as Romain says in the chat, it's the only thing that's truly accessible. It's the only thing that's truly accessible to people. It's just that. It's really just that. Because good or bad judgments and true false judgments, they're not that accessible, okay? And folks, I'm not even through the introduction, okay? If any of this is blowing your mind now, just you wait. Just you wait for what I got planned for you folks. Just you wait, right? Okay? So the definition of wisdom is literally an amalgamation of true, false, and good, bad judgments. An amalgamation of TIFE, axis, plus FITE, axis. An amalgamation of these things. So, and here's an example. Here's an example of what wisdom looks like under this definition. And in my opinion, it is the true definition of what wisdom is. So, wisdom knows when to be true. It knows when to be false. It knows when to be good. And it knows when to be bad. And you can confirm this if you compare this to the words of Solomon in Ecclesiastes, because he said, there's a time for death, there's a time for eating, there's a time for mourning, there's a time for dying, there's a time for being sick, there's a time for being healthy, there's a time for everything under the sun. That is the main point he was trying to make, okay? So, wisdom is an amalgamation of true, false, and good or bad judgments. It knows when to be true, it knows when to be false, it knows when to be good, it knows when to be bad, which means it knows when to be evil. Wisdom is evil. It knows when to be evil. It knows when to do wrong. It knows when to do bad. Have you guys ever figured that out? It's so funny to me to watch INFPs judge their own INFP, Robert Greene, on his books of wisdom, the 33 Strategies of War, the 48 Laws of Power, Mastery, the 50th Law, the Laws of Human Nature. They get so judgmental, these FI heroes, they get so judgmental of their own INFP brother who wrote these books of wisdom, basically, and telling him he's a bad person because those books are evil. Have you guys ever thought about that? Have you ever thought about it? Like, seriously. So, that's what wisdom is. Wisdom doesn't really have anything to do with love, other than it is wise to love and forgive other people. Okay? So, the thing is that you cannot really truly love somebody until you have the wisdom to love yourself first. You see what I'm saying? Wisdom is a prerequisite to love. Okay? To be able to get to a point where you're actually, like, expressing true love, you have to actually have some semblance of wisdom. Otherwise, like, especially in the terms of a sexual relationship, you're just being selfish. You see what I'm saying? Like, you're just being selfish. It doesn't actually help, right? And you need to have the wisdom to get to the point where you understand other people. It's just like that meme, you know too much psychology because you can't get mad at anyone because you can explain the reason behind why they say and do anything they do. That's correct. This is why Jesus doesn't get mad at people, because obviously he knows psychological type, obviously. And because he knows psychological type, he literally understands why every human being around him is behaving the way that they behave. He completely gets them. He gets them. And this is what allows Jesus Christ to be so forgiving to other people, because he understands them. And because you have to have the wisdom to reach understanding, and then once you have the understanding, and you have no choice but to forgive other people because you understand them. You have no choice, because wisdom will require you to understand other people. And then the understanding, because you're wise, will require you to forgive others. And then because also of wisdom, and you've understood them and you have forgiven them, it will require you to love them. You will end up loving them because it is wise to do so, right? Because it is written, love your neighbor as yourself, right? So this, in essence, is the outcome or the result of having wisdom. This is why wisdom is so important, because it's through wisdom that we actually find a future for ourselves. And it's so funny because I got a friend of mine who gives me so much shit. He's like, oh, C.S. Joseph, you're just a Gnostic, I'm not a Gnostic. You're always preaching gnosis because you're preaching that wisdom is salvation for all. And I'm like, no, I'm just stating salvation can't take place without wisdom to be around there, because you can't even love or forgive your neighbor because you can't understand them. And you have to come to understanding of self as well, because it is written, love your neighbor as yourself. How can you make these concepts, figured out? Like, you have to understand that. So, and Romain is correct. Wisdom is not contradictory to absolute truth and absolute good. And it is definitely where they merge. This is how humanity gains access, even finite, temporary access to absolute good and absolute truth, and they get it through wisdom. Wisdom is the doorway. Wisdom is the conduit. So use your judging functions to develop wisdom. Stop playing God and judging people good or evil. Stop playing God and judging people, truth tellers, or liars. It doesn't actually help or mean anything. And you guys just got to understand that. That's reality. When you saying like, oh, that guy's a good man, you're playing God. Oh, that guy's really evil, he killed somebody, you're still playing God. When you're sitting there, in court, dealing justice, and justice is blind, still playing God. All those judges, still playing God. You're executing somebody, you're playing God. You're playing God. Still. This is why the earliest cultures of the world, that they're the worst punishment that could ever be applied to a human being wasn't death. No, it wasn't death at all. It wasn't removal of limbs. It wasn't maiming. It wasn't anything like that. The absolute worst death, or the worst punishment that could be given to a human being, was actually exile. And usually when they're exiled, they end up dying of starvation or something afterwards. But in the earliest cultures of recorded history, and even, rumored before recorded history, exile was the absolute worst form of punishment. And this would even happen like in Athens. They would actually vote to exile somebody from Athens because they just couldn't handle that one person, or the concept of the black sheep, basically, exile. Okay, so I think exile is a much better form of punishment than like just outright executing people. There's better ways of doing that. So anyway, please understand, this is what the essence of wisdom is and where it comes from. So let's actually look at some Jungian archetypes, and this comes out of the book Ion by Carl Jung, which is definitely the #1 source material for the 4 sides of the mind. If you haven't watched Ion or read the book Ion, Aion, I highly recommend it. And if you don't like me talking about Jesus Christ, well, then you're going to have to take it up with Carl Jung, because more than half that book, he's talking about Jesus Christ. But in chapters 1 through 5, he's really talking about the 4 sides of the mind, and the rest of the book, he's talking about Jesus Christ as his main example for his arguments, which I think is awesome. Locking them up is not the same as exile. It's a form of exile, but it's not identical. It's not the same. Because leaving a human being to fend for themselves in the wilderness is not the same as locking them up, where you still have the responsibility of feeding them, etc., and all of the expense that goes along with that, right? Could you imagine just throwing a bunch of criminals on a boat and then just dropping them off at Antarctica and say good luck? Could you imagine that? You see what I'm saying? Like, exile is so much more different than what we do. There's a reason why penal colonies exist, right? It's what Australia's heritage is based on. It's not the same as putting people in jail. It is a form of exile, technically. I have to agree with, that nitpick. But it's not how it was done, a long time ago. So anyway, I've just proven to you that wisdom is really the only thing that's really truly accessible to man, and that judging something good versus evil and judging something true versus false is actually the stuff of God, and we are playing God when we actually do make those decisions. Which basically means, if you think about it, all of humanity is playing God at all times. At all times. And it's so interesting, because if you think about it, because the serpent, when he's talking to Eve in the Garden of Eden, here, eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and you will be like God. You will be like God. And then she did. And then Adam did. They ate the fruit. And now all of a sudden, humanity's playing God. Think about that. Well, we can actually go even deeper on the Garden of Eden example. A lot deeper. So, we go a lot deeper. So let's go into the Garden of Eden now. So there are 2 trees in the Garden of Eden, according to the symbols and the lore, especially, as analyzed by Carl Jung and also John Milton. If you haven't read Paradise Lost by John Milton, what are you doing with your life? You need to read that book. But there's 2 trees in the Garden of Eden. There's the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. And I want you to understand symbolically what these trees actually represent, okay? So what is the tree of life? The tree of life is objectivity. That's what it is. It's objectivity. Raw, cold, hard, painful logic. It's logos, basically. The tree of knowledge is subjectivity. It is ethos, basically. Or you could argue pathos to a point. But in terms of logos, ethos, pathos, there's actually a fourth one which is never mentioned, and it should be mentioned. I forget what it's called. But which represents, you have logic, you have ethics, you have rationale, and you have morality, right? So morality is actually attached to the tree of knowledge, right? Now, granted, the tree of knowledge and the fruit of the tree of knowledge, that was actually sexuality. And that's the end result of that subjectivity. And it is definitely, according to Jordan Peterson, the expedient route instead of the meaningful route, which is the tree of life. But given that the tree of life is very objective, okay, it's very sharp, it's very painful, because we liken the logos or TI or, TI truth, telling, etc. to like swords, right? You have the icy sword of truth and the fiery sword of truth. Those swords of truth, they cut, they're very painful. So you could imagine that the tree of life in the garden and it had fruit, right? Just like the tree of knowledge, right? But the fruit of the tree of life would likely be razor sharp, not in the like of, Dumbledore in Harry Potter 6, which is the Half-Blood Prince. And he's saying, hey, you can go ahead and eat those candies over there, but be careful, they're sharp. And then, one of them actually bites Harry, when he's in Dumbledore's office, right? That's kind of what I liken the fruit of the tree of life to. It's very sharp, basically. What if it has huge-ass spikes coming out of it? And then Adam and Eve are looking at this fruit, and they're like, you want me to eat that? Right? You see what I'm saying? I'm just using, a symbological comparison here, right? But the reality of the situation is that the tree of life is not very pleasing to the eye. We can assume this. This is a working assumption, logical TI working assumption, because you have the serpent telling Eve, or Eve admitting in a conversation with the serpent, that the fruit of the tree of knowledge is very pleasing to the eye. And based on that statement, I would conclude or assume, right, that the fruit of the tree of life was actually not that all appealing, right? And of course it wouldn't be. Who really wants to be fed harsh reality and the truth of everything? Who really wants to do that? I'd rather go live in La La Land over the tree of knowledge, right? I'd rather live mentally in subjectivity. You know what's funny? When you're living in subjectivity, you are subject to it. You are a slave to subjectivity. This is why wisdom is the stuff of man, and good and evil and truth versus falsehood is the stuff of God. Well, wait a minute. What is the tree of knowledge named? That's right. The tree of knowledge of good and evil. The tree of knowledge of good versus evil. The tree of life, what is that? It's the tree of T-I-F-E, right? Whereas the tree of knowledge is the tree of F-I-T-E. Interesting. Interesting how that works. You can even go a little bit further, because even Carl Jung states within the book Ion that logos wasn't really utilized that much by people throughout the world up until the time of Jesus, because Jesus was representative as what the New Agers call the Christ consciousness, basically. And the Christ consciousness equals the logos. And up until Jesus' time, very few people ever used logos. It really wasn't very common. And I wonder if there's a chance that there was less TI users, way less TI users in that day than AD. Was there less TI users in BC times versus AD? I don't know. I have no idea. But it's definitely an interesting concept to ponder, But Jung is making the argument that Jesus Christ represents the Logos, and the Logos has finally been brought to the world. Jesus Christ also, within the Bible, has been compared directly to the tree of life, okay? Also known as the Logos, right? With its razor-sharp fruit, the fiery sword of truth, the icy sword of truth, T-I, okay? So that's That's the basis or the argument. This is why the tree of life is about objectivity versus subjectivity. And before Christ, according to Jung and according to many, many others in my studies, there is a lack of objectivity amongst mankind. It was a huge jump for the collective unconscious of man to all of a sudden finally have the logos collectively unlocked for all of humanity at the time of Jesus Christ. It was basically collectively unlocked. Means that there was actually a path to the tree of life, finally, through Jesus Christ. And even Jung talks about this, in many of his works, especially his most terrifying book, Ion, which even Jordan Peterson admitted was the most terrifying book he's ever read in his life. Yeah, we should probably add... no, we did not reschedule Ivy. Ivy's probably behind. Could someone inform her what's going on? So based on that, here's another way of looking at the tree of life versus the tree of knowledge. The tree of life, from a Taoist point of view, represents the yang. The tree of knowledge represents the yin. The yin is chaos. It's also the external. It's also closer to nature. Whereas the tree of life is the internal, right? It's also and being able to have the logos finally and having that harsh truth of the reality that we live in, even though all of nature around us is subject to the subjectivity of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because we didn't study at the tree of life. We were supposed to study at the tree of life first. Humanity was supposed to receive objectivity first before subjectivity. And the absolute best portrayal of that conflict that I've ever seen in pop culture is actually in Star Trek. It's especially if you watch anything that has to do with Vulcan culture, about Spock or Ambassador Sarek, and if you watch Star Trek Enterprise and where Commander T'Pol ends up going to Vulcan, and they find this artifact that has to do with like the Vulcan version of Jesus, basically, who preached logic instead of emotion. So the tree of knowledge represents emotion, whereas the tree of life represents logic or truth, etc. And then the Vulcans adopted their tree of life. They adopted their objectivity instead of being subject to subjectivity anymore. And the Vulcans that wanted to stay subject to subjectivity, well, they left. And those are the Romulans, right? Okay? So they are the tree of knowledge Vulcans, while true Vulcans at their main home of Vulcan, those are the logical Vulcans. They are the tree of life Vulcans, basically. And you can watch this this entire culture kind of expand and contract, and you can get to understanding about how this space culture, this fictional culture, actually works. You can watch. There's plenty of it in Star Trek Discovery, all 3 seasons, especially season 2, and you can also find out more in anything that has Leonard Nimoy's portrayal of Spock, and as well as Star Trek Enterprise, and I believe it's season 3 that has that in there. So why would she eat the fruit if it wasn't appealing? Well, because it's also the easy road, dude. Of course, like it is the easy road. That's why she'd also eat the fruit. And don't forget, the fruit itself, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, actually was sexuality. Do you know why? Because the tree of knowledge is the yin, okay? And the yin is where, so the yang fertilizes the yin, right? The yang fertilizes the yin. And the yin is the cave. And going back to Plato's allegory of the cave. The yin is the cave, and that, or it is the womb where a human being is born. So life is born out of the yin, basically. You can extract the yang. The yang fertilizes the yin, puts something in the yin, and then it grows in that chaos, and then becomes something more, and then it leaves the yin. This is why the yin is the mother, or like Mother Nature. Right? You could even argue in some Christian circles that the yin may actually be the Holy Spirit, which is also pretty crazy if you think about it. But why not? I mean, the Holy Spirit is kind of linked to the starter interaction style, all about getting things going, not really finishing. It's all about starting the process. And 3 of those 4 types are all extroverted intuition users. And extrovert intuition is attached to the yin more than any of the other cognitive functions because it itself is pure chaos. The yin is extrovert intuition. That's what it's about. So why couldn't you make that argument? You would have to make that argument. Okay? So that's where that comes from. In subjectivity is where life is fertilized and inserted, and then it grows, and then it becomes objective, becomes a human being, basically, becomes objective. This is the entire process. But in terms of the collective unconscious of man, the collective unconscious of man is still within the tree of knowledge and has not had access to the tree of life. And according to Jung and many other people, very few people had that access to the logos, and they gained access to the logos. This is also heavily discussed in Masonic lore. It's also heavily discussed in Theosophy, the writings of Elena Blavatsky, as well as Manly P. Hall, Albert Pike, which, in my opinion, are very evil. Oh, look, there's Chase playing God, saying something is evil. You see what I'm saying? You know, because I have FI Trickster, right? You know, so good or evil is kind of really subjective to me. Just like to a TI Trickster, truth versus falsehood is also very subjective to them. Both perspectives are valid. Both perspectives are relevant. Okay? This is why. All right? So like I said, before Christ, lack of objectivity. Humanity is slaves of subjectivity. But after Christ, humanity is no longer necessarily a slave to subjectivity unless they choose to be. They have a choice afterwards. They don't have to be that slave to subjectivity, or they can be objective. So after Christ, human beings have the opportunity to learn the lesson of the tree of life. And the road to objectivity requires wisdom. This is why humanity needs to actually prioritize wisdom over true false judgments or good bad, good evil judgments. It has to be the priority. And don't forget, wisdom itself is too subjective because it's an amalgamation of true versus false and good versus evil. And it knows when to be good, when to be bad, when to be true, when to be false. It knows when to. Wisdom knows when it's okay to lie. Wisdom knows when it's okay to be evil as much as to be good or truthful. Okay? That's the difference, right? And as a result, wisdom, therefore, is able to create the ultimate commandment, which, obviously the first one is love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second one is like it, love your neighbor as yourself, okay? So think about it. Human beings. All human beings, they all have this problem. You ever hear about people binge eating, lacking self-discipline? Do you hear about people, shooting up heroin, smoking crack or meth, doing activities that actually harm them, self-harm, including people committing suicide, etc.? When a person does that kind of self-harm, they're actually all about the tree of knowledge and that subjectivity, and they are not about the tree of life. Because if a person is about the tree of life, they accept the harsh reality of the environment and their life as they know it. They accept their responsibility, they accept their harsh reality of it, and they work to fix things. The TI function is where they have the realization that something is wrong. And the FE function is used to fix the problem. This is why TIFE users like to fix everything. And FIT users don't like it. Whoa, you're saying I need to be fixed, Oh, so I must be a bad person. There must be something wrong with me, right? And that's how they react to TIFE users, always trying to fix something. It's all about fixing. See what I'm saying, folks? So that could be a problem. So that's the issue. So of course the easy road is appealing. Just like, how INFJs think that committing suicide or cutting themselves is appealing, even though they're just further proving that they're either the most worthless people on the earth or the most useful people on the earth. Because if they're all about the tree of life, they wouldn't allow themselves to get to that standpoint where they are worthless. They wouldn't allow themselves to get there at all. They wouldn't allow it. And that could be that's important. Because having that knowledge of tree of life means you're willing to take care of yourself. It means you're willing to take responsibility to meet your own needs, and that you have personal standards, that you have personal boundaries, and you enforce them. And then you have your personal goals, right? That's what the tree of life is all about. It's all about taking care of your responsibilities. It's about having self-respect. The tree of knowledge or the subjectivity is about being focused on the external. It's like when the Marxists try to tell you, or the communists try to tell you, well, you are your brother's keeper. Like, okay, thank you, tree of knowledge people, thank you. But there's no tree of life there because they would actually sacrifice themselves for the sake of other people, which is actually wrong. And it's also unwise. Even Malcolm X would preach against that, because Malcolm X, he was a Muslim even. And he's a black dude, and he's telling people, let's just recreate Black Wall Street after a bunch of the KKK came into the Black Wall Street and murdered an entire black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And he's like, well, let's rebuild Tulsa, but let's do it in New Hampshire and have our own black state with our own black governor, our own black legislature, with our black senators and our black representatives that we elect to the government. And it's our black community, our black state. And we have our own laws. And we choose to segregate ourselves and make our own culture better. If your culture has lived on this world forever, and it is the only culture that stands on this planet, and there is one culture that's been around for thousands of years, and it's been here since the beginning, and it's still here, and it still isn't gone. People say it's the Chinese. No, it's not the Chinese, but their culture is pretty old. But no, it's the same culture. They have the same customs. They do the same thing thousands of years later. And that's a very successful culture. But how could your culture be so successful without being prejudiced, without being racist? Think about that. How is that possible, right? How is that possible? But then again, you look at the Cajuns. They're not even speaking Acadian French anymore. It's becoming a dead language. And then there's the dead languages of the Native Americans, right? And then black culture is looking externally to other people, taking in government handouts, for example. You have people like Kevin Samuels, who is black, who is an ENTP, and I think he's like the second coming of Malcolm X personally, talking about how white women are better than black women, and that's why black men prefer white women over black women, because black women are just way too solipsistic, way too out to lunch from his point of view. And this is what he says consistently. And then he gets angry black women to join his live stream and try to argue, but they can't. And they can never refute him, ever. Because by the time he's done with them, they admit that, yeah, okay, there's something wrong with their culture. And it's because their culture has been very without instead of within. The tree of life is about within, whereas the tree of knowledge is all about without. You can argue that the tree of life is introverted, whereas the tree of knowledge is extroverted. Well, I guess it would have to be if the tree of life is objective and the tree of knowledge is subjective, because subjectivity is the extroverted. It is the external, whereas the tree of life is the internal. Okay? And Malcolm X understood these things. This is why Malcolm X is trying to tell black people, hey, listen, y'all African Americans need to go move up to New Hampshire and be about ourselves and be about our internal culture. That would be an amazing example of American exceptionalism. If black culture was able to pull that off within the United States of America, they'd be more American than anybody else in the United States of America, because that is what American exceptionalism is about. The fact that any community can be all about themselves. And as long as other communities show them mutual respect, and they're showing mutual respect to other communities, and giving people the choice to leave and to join, if they can, to be inclusive within the boundaries of the purpose of their community to begin with, mind you, right? Because that still has to be respected. That is an example of what it means to be American. Exactly. Because it follows the system to the law, to the point. And that's what he's trying to do, is trying to get these people within his culture to understand that, hey, we are the problem. Stop trying to blame everybody else. Stop trying to blame the white man. Stop trying to, and he's trying to remind people, like Malcolm X did a speech one time, is like, hey, the people you need to hate more than the white man, you need to hate the people that sold you into slavery. Oh, wait, that's right. It's fellow black people. It's fellow Africans. It's actually one of the reasons why I was listening to a podcast recently where some guy said, and Kevin Samuels was on it, And he's saying that, there's a reason why African Americans just do not like Africans at all. And one of the reasons why culturally is because they know that they were sold into slavery by their own people. And then Kevin Samuels, and as much as Malcolm X before him, were making the argument that African Americans sell each other out all the time. And that's the problem. And saying that they're, when they sell each other out, and they sell each other out to like potentially the white man, or they sell each other out to society, etc., them having that sell-out culture ingrained, or that sell-out nurture ingrained within black culture, is one of the worst things. And Malcolm X says to get rid of that, we have to reset. We have to be more like the tree of life and not the tree of knowledge, right? That's where that comes from, okay? That's where it is. So this is very, very important for you guys to understand, because this directly ties into what we've been talking about with our Master the Demon lectures that we've been doing. Transforming the demon into the angel, right? And understanding like what the demon function is. The demon function really evil then? I mean, what business do we have judging our neighbor good versus bad? What business do we have judging them true versus false? We have no business. So we need to be wise, okay? Because if you're playing God with your judgment functions, guess what? You're being prejudiced. You're being a psychological racist. Okay? And society is definitely psychologically racist towards my son. They're trying to put my son in this special ed right now. He doesn't need to be in special ed. He needs to be, he's an INFJ. He needs to be in a proper education setup that is more helpful for his psychological type, because they're trying to treat him like some STJ. Well, guess what? His STJ is his demon, so of course he's going to react negatively. What do you expect? That's what's going to happen. Of course he's not going to do well. You're putting him in his superego, damn it. So they're trying to they're trying to do this, and I of course am taking up that fight, and I'm like, no, not going to let you do that. You can't do that because you are psychologically racist towards my son. Okay? This is why I can make the argument that, guess what, folks? Everybody, every human being on this planet is racist, is prejudiced, psychologically, okay? So before everyone's starting to freak out about people judging each other about the color of their skin, you have to get to the point where you accept that you yourself are prejudiced, especially when considering cognitive projection. I have a cutting edge episode that discusses cognitive projection. I believe I have a cognitive mechanics episode for season 18 that discusses cognitive projection, where people are projecting their own type or their camaraderie type, their highest camaraderie or their highest compatibility and their superego onto other people and expecting other people to behave based on one of the four sides of their own mind. That's projection. And guess what? That is a form of racism. That is a form of prejudice. Okay? So there's psychological prejudice everywhere. You go try to set up an SJ oligarchy down in anarchy-based Mexico. You think you're going to be really popular down there? No, because that anarchy is prejudiced against the oligarchy or the fascism or the communism of the other three temperaments. It's no different in Japan. Do you think Japan would have any respect for SP types? No. They're an NJ society that mostly favors NTJs over NFJs, but still an NFJ society, and they would still be prejudiced culturally towards SPs because SPs challenge their culture. You see what I'm saying, folks? So that's the issue. So, does the importance of culture matter more to a certain quadra? I mean, matter in what way? What do you mean? What do you mean, Donnell or Donnell? What do you mean? Matter more in what capacity? So, anyway, love your neighbor as yourself is so important because let's examine love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself is the highest form of wisdom that exists. It is, in my opinion, the absolute form of goodness and truth. Because you have to know the truth of reality, the harsh reality around you, to be able to love your neighbor as yourself. You have to be completely 100% boldly honest with yourself and other people to love yourself and others. It is absolute truth. Love your neighbor as yourself is also the absolute good at the same time. But let's break down the sentence, love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor. Okay, well, guess what? That's attached to the tree of knowledge because it is external. Love your neighbor as yourself. The as yourself piece is attached to the tree of life. And you have no business loving your neighbor or caring for your neighbor or caring or loving anyone else until you can love yourself first. This is why the tree of life must come first in your life, not the tree of knowledge of good and evil, not the easy road. You need to focus on what is meaningful, not what is expedient. That is the only way to do it. And it is meaningful to take care of yourselves. Guess what? You go out there, people don't take care of themselves. People don't shower when they should, right? They don't eat when they should. They don't eat what they should, when they should, or how much they should. They binge. They watch Netflix when they shouldn't. They play video games or a lot of video games when they shouldn't. They spend too much time on the wrong things. Human beings do not take care of themselves. And that's because human beings studied under the tree of knowledge first before the tree of life. They wanted that pleasing fruit at the tree of knowledge. They didn't want to go for that razor sharp, painful, spiky fruit that when they ingest it, gives them like food poisoning and it hurts. And they're probably barfing up constantly and vomiting because of the harsh reality that they have to endure under the truth of the tree of life, right? The point is, folks, it's not that the order matters. I'm not here to say, one tree is, more important than the other. It's not about that. It's about the order matters. Go to the tree of life before you go to the tree of knowledge. Live your life that way. Love your neighbor as yourself means you have to take care of yourself and love yourself before you love others. It also means that you have the wisdom to realize that you shouldn't be prejudiced and judge someone good or evil. You judge someone a good person, guess what? You're prejudiced. You are ignorant. You lack wisdom because you're playing God. Stop playing God. I do it all the time. I'm a hypocrite. I'll tell you right now, I'm a hypocrite. I do it all the time, every day. Okay? Stop judging somebody, good or bad. Judge them ignorant or wise, if you can. Or forgive them because you know that they don't actually know anything. And it's okay for them to know anything because you don't either. We're actually all at the same level. We're not special. That's something really hard for an FI user to accept, that they're not special. No matter how many achievements they have in their whole life, they're not special. Do you think they have the ability to get over their superiority complex for that? Or a TI user, is like, oh, you're not the most useful person. I don't care how useful you are. You're not really that useful. Because you don't actually really know everything. You don't actually really know the truth, do you, Mr. Working Assumptions? This is why we need to have humility, folks. It's the whole point. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's both trees in combination. It is all of the judgment-making functions on both axes, TIFE and FITE, together. An amalgamation of good versus evil and true versus false equals wisdom. See what I'm saying? That's what it equals, wisdom. Get the wisdom that you need to be able to love your neighbor as yourself. That is the entire point of human existence. It's just you can't get wisdom without suffering. Because when you eat the fruit of the tree of life, it's razor sharp, it's very pointy, it's venomous. It hurts. You'll vomit. Good luck. Suffering is how you gain wisdom. Because if you're not willing to suffer at the tree of life, you're going to be subject to subjectivity. And you'll literally live your life an ignorant slave for the rest of your existence. That sucks. And then you're really just loving yourself and not anyone else. Or you're loving everyone else and not yourself. What a pathetic existence for a life. You don't want that. That's not who you are, right? The point is, folks, people talk about sin. What is sin? Sin is, this is my final point before I end here. Sin is defined as, missing the mark. People think that being evil is sinful. No, it's not. Being evil is not sinful. It is not. Because wisdom, folks. So wisdom, I would wager, is the opposite of sin. So missing the mark or being incomplete, that's what sin is. That's what original sin is. Original sin is that we're born foolish. Wisdom is the opposite of sin. Not goodness. Okay? Being evil does not mean one person is sinful, because a wise person knows when it's time to be evil, because there's a time for everything under the sun. Even Solomon, the wisest man in the world, said that. Defying God? No, defying God is not that. Defying God is not sinful per se. It's being ignorant to the point that you end up defying God because you are ignorant. That is the sin. Okay? So become wise. And this is not me saying that, wisdom equals salvation. Don't conflate what I'm saying. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not. But the thing is that without the tree of life, without suffering in your life, you'll never gain the wisdom that you need to find out. Make sure that you guys understand that. It's not good enough that you're a TIFE user. You are still responsible for the FITE. It's not good enough that you're an FITE user. You're still responsible for the TIFE. It is your responsibility to study at both trees. And we were supposed to study at the Tree of Life first. That way we could take care of ourselves and learn how to take care of ourselves before we care for our neighbor. Right? I got into a debate with a communist just this last week. He's talking about how great it is and how it's going to be like the ultimate ideal world and utopia, etc. And I'm like, okay, let me ask you this. So 55% of the world is interdependent with their psychology. They're affiliative, 55%. And 55% of the world may accept communism. But what about the other 45% that doesn't? Are you going to force your ideal world on other people? And by forcing it, are you not creating a hell on earth for those 45% of other people? How arrogant of you, right? Is it really that ideal then? No, it's not. It's not ideal. And I explained to him, this is why your position is unwise. It is ignorant. Because in reality, the situation is that communism really, at best, could benefit 15% of the population of the planet. Not 100% of the population of the planet. Same goes with fascism. Same goes with anarchy. Same goes with oligarchy. It's no different, folks. It's no different. Yes, sin is missing the aim. And the aim is to gain wisdom so that you have the ability, so that you are enabled to understand others and yourself, and to forgive others and yourself, and to love your neighbor as yourself. That is the pinnacle of absolute truth and the pinnacle of absolute good. That is what you should be aiming for. If you're not aiming for that, you're unwise. You're being foolish. You need to get to the point that you really don't know a damn thing. You have to be willing to accept that you're not a good person, but you're not a bad person either. You got to get to the point that you don't always tell the truth, but you're not always a liar either. You got to welcome the state of neutrality on all these things, because the neutrality is the beginning to the path of wisdom. And that's why at the beginning of this lecture I talked about the trickster functions, FI trickster and TI trickster. Because those functions are very neutral on the tree of life and the tree of knowledge for you to move in this path. They're very neutral to get to that point. All right? And that's where that comes from. That's how you can understand it. All right? Yeah. Yep, the greater the suffering, the greater the peace. So if you're avoiding suffering in your life, you're being unwise. I highly recommend you guys read Mark Manson, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, and his second book, Everything is Fucked. Because then you'll start to see, like, it doesn't matter how happy you really are in life. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Mark Manson, very similar, because he's an ENTP, to Malcolm X, and a Socrates, and a Solomon. He knows what he's talking about from that point of view. Please consider what he's saying. All right. Now it's time for Q&A. Anyone have any questions about this Cutting Edge podcast episode? Because I am now finished with all of my points. So basically, I guess in summary, stop being so judgmental because you're playing God when you're judgmental. Understand the difference between the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, and understand the subjectivity versus objectivity. And if you really were objective, you'd be taking care of yourself because that's the internal. And then before you worry about the external, you have to do the order correctly and do it that way. If you're a people pleaser, wow, you're doing it wrong. You're Mr. or Miss Tree of Knowledge, and you're failing miserably. That's a sin. So understand where it's all about. Recognize the only thing you can really have in life is wisdom, but the wisdom is there so that you can get to the ultimate point of love your neighbor as yourself, because there is no higher truth and there is no higher value. It requires absolute truth to get there, and it requires absolute good to get there, but you won't be able to know what those things are, so you have to use wisdom as your pathway to get there. And that's how you do it, regardless if you're an FITE user or a TIFE user. Doesn't matter. You're still responsible for both. You are still responsible for both trees. So make it happen, folks. Luckily, according to Carl Jung and others, Jesus came and gave us the logos, and we now have that opportunity to do so for like the first time ever, according to the collective unconscious of man. We have a future. So, all right. Let's read some of these things here. Okay. I don't know why we're talking about Power Rangers. That's funny. I read somewhere that TE is recharged by yoga. Would love to hear your thoughts on that. Haha. I don't know enough about yoga to make that judgment. Sorry. I don't know. Or advice on recharging TE Trickster in general. I don't know. Listen to other people. Danelle S. asks, do you judge based on the lack of parent function of each type? I don't know in what context you're asking that question. Can you please explain that? I'm just not entirely sure what that means. Isn't idolatry a form of love? Not really, because love requires wisdom, and it's not wise to be idolatrous. You could be admiring something, but that's not love. Take care of yourself as if you were someone you were responsible for helping. Exactly. Do you think more functions are going to be discovered or will evolve new ones? Kind of, but that gets into the argument of demigod functions and god functions, and I'm not ready to have that discussion yet. Not really willing to have that discussion yet, but I will leave a little teaser for that. And it's an old line from an old cartoon from the 1990s, or maybe the late 1980s. I don't remember. But when our powers combine, I am Captain Planet. And that's all I'll say for that. Jay Patel, will any kind of suffering help us gain wisdom? Not necessarily, Jay. Not necessarily. And there is a line I would like to share from a book relating to that. Let's see. Let's see if I can find it here. Okay. There was Robert, if you're there, maybe you can help me find that statement that you gave me relating to that. Trying to scroll up in our conversations, Microsoft Teams, to try to find it. Let's see. Okay. No. Okay. I can't find it. Gosh. We were having a nerdgasm over Naruto. Let's see here. Oh, gosh. Wait a minute. Nope, that's not it. Okay. Nope. Nope. Apparently, I don't know where it is. Okay. I'll try to explain it in general, but how Robert put it was like perfect. And that's too bad that I can't find it. Okay, cool. So any kind of suffering won't help you gain wisdom, because sometimes suffering for suffering's sake is not good enough. Here's an example: SI demon and SE demon. Okay, they're both trying to get the person who has them to behave a little bit differently. So SI demon is trying to get the INJ to put in more effort because they're just Mr. Shortcut, right? They're all about shortcuts. They don't actually want to put in effort. Whereas SE demon is trying to tell the SI inferior, hey, you're putting in way too much effort, but it's not, you need to learn how to do it right the first time. So if you're going to suffer for the right thing and suffer in the right way, instead of having wasted suffering. So you have to understand that you can have unwise suffering. Wise suffering means that it will never go to waste. So just make sure that your suffering is not wasteful, I guess, is how to put it. Okay. Armitage, to shadow-focused people tend to be more balanced with the functions and therefore have more wisdom. In my experience, I would say yes, but it's so subjective a topic that it's really difficult to say either way. But if I'm going to compare it directly to a subconscious-focused person, definitely a shadow-focused person would be a lot wiser than a subconscious-focused person, in my experience. Cayman, do you see yourself doing an interview with Jordan Peterson in the near future? Andrus, thank you. Andrus says, Mark Manson says, suffer for a purpose. Thank you. Awesome. Although Mark Manson is a little beta in his relationship books, but it is what it is. Cayman, do you see yourself doing an interview with Jordan Peterson in the near future? I mean, sure, I guess. I don't know. I don't think he cares, honestly, but that would be nice. It would be really nice. So, awesome. All right. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions, folks, so I think this is I think this is it for the night. So, any of you folks, thank you all for watching, and thank you for coming. I will do my best to get the camera quality fixed, and I hope the sound was good. Can you guys let me know in the chat if the sound was good? I'd really like to just double check with everyone that the sound was good for this. Oh, another question. If a TI user has been very focused on figuring out what is good, morals, I guess, what is good, might that cause a transition into the superego? What would that look like? Yes, it could potentially cause a transition in the superego eventually, more like a transition into your shadow, actually. But then it will help you slowly unlock your superego over time. And more about that in Season 19. If you don't have Season 19, go to csjoseph.life/portal and click on the Discover XYZ type. And the Season 19 episode for each of the 16 types is in those, where I talk about that process. Otherwise, you can watch the membership lecture series where we're talking about how to master your demon. That's the other one. Sound is good. All right, cool. Oh, does suffering inform the perceiving functions? Yes, it does. Absolutely, it does. I'm glad you liked the lecture, Cayman. These get pretty deep, the cutting edge episodes. So, all right, folks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.